You have to be bold to put yourself out there, to share your characters and your ideas and your thoughts, however confident you are, and I am, and however much of a grown-up you are, and I am. You still feel vulnerable at the moment your book goes out into the world in a way that you don't with almost anything else.
Hello, and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund, or RLF for short. I'm Caroline Sanderson, and I'm a non-fiction writer and books journalist. On this podcast, we bring special hand-picked author guests into conversation with the extensive bank of recorded archive material which the RLF has built up over the past decade or so. This archive features a wide range of writers discussing different aspects of their experience and process. And consequently, the recordings present a much more rounded picture of the writing life than you might find elsewhere. Today, we welcome Kate Mosse to the Collected podcast. Kate is an award-winning novelist, playwright, essayist, and non-fiction writer. The author of 11 novels and short story collections, her books have been translated into 38 languages and published in more than 40 countries. Her fiction includes the multi-million-selling Languedoc trilogy and the Joubert Family Chronicles, while her most recent work of non-fiction is the history book Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries. Forthcoming is her first book for young adults, Feminist History for Every Day of the Year. Kate Mosse is the founder-director of the Women's Prize for Fiction and the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, and of the global Women in History campaign. She's also, I think, one of the most liked and admired people in publishing, certainly by me, and not least for her work in championing non-fiction by women. Kate, welcome. I've been much enjoying your most recent novel, The Map of Bones, which is the fourth and concluding book in the Joubert Family Chronicles. And as well as being an incredibly immersive novel, it also feels to me to encapsulate so much that matters to you and makes you tick as a writer. An extraordinary setting, a compelling crux of a historical period, and trailblazing women of the kind we should know more about but don't.
Well, thank you. That's lovely. I loved writing it, The Map of Bones, not least of all because it's the fourth in a series. I mean, you can read it alone, but it's the fourth in a series that started 12 years ago, nearly 13 years ago, in Franschhoek in South Africa. And then I had this big idea for a huge novel about words, really, and women's voices and the way that women tell stories and how women's stories are lost and they are retained and how they're written. And I started the series in 1562, back in my beloved Carcassonne, and then wrote up to this final novel in the series, The Map of Bones, which is set in 1688 and 9 and 1862. And it's only the second time in my writing career, when I was writing the epilogue and the end of that book, I got quite weepy because it did feel like saying goodbye to a huge body of work and a hugely long period of my life.
Absolutely. And these big series of novels. Yeah, it's a great slice of your writing creative life, isn't it? Now, before becoming a published writer, you worked in publishing yourself, and I'd like to talk about that and whether it gave you any kind of competitive advantage in the incredibly competitive business of getting published. And I don't mean that in any sense of who you know, but in the editorial sense of familiarity with the nuts and bolts of what makes a good story. So to get us thinking about this theme, let's hear our first clip. Here's non-fiction writer Polly Morland, talking to me actually, about how experience from her previous career as a television documentary maker fed into her own writing.
So I spent about 15 odd years working in documentaries, and I went in at entry level, answering the phone, picking up the executive producers, dry cleaning, and then gradually worked my way up. And I, in the end, was making films across quite a broad spectrum. I did quite a lot of sort of contemporary current affairs. So not the kind of panorama investigations, but a kind of snapshot. I did a big series about terrorism, a kind of history of terrorism that came out not long, I think on the first or second anniversary of 9/11. So that was tracking back through terrorism as it had manifested across Europe and in Latin America. I did a big series about, I'm trying to remember my my professional back catalogue. I did a big series about the kind of economics of organised crime. That was for the BBC, and looking at the kind of economic structures that supported money laundering and all clustered around a lot of fantastic human stories from both former criminals and victims of crime. That was a fascinating series to work on. I did some arts television as well. So basically, in short, I worked across quite a kind of broad spectrum of serious documentaries. And it was the most fantastic education in a certain mode of storytelling, I suppose.
And you travel quite widely as well.
I travelled very widely for it, so which was sort of glorious through my 20s and early 30s. So I was looking back through the films I'd made. I filmed several times in America, but filmed in 14 or 15 different countries around the world at different times, and it's a very particular mode of travelling. It's a very particular way to experience a different place and to immerse yourself in the stories there. So it was a wonderful experience, but there's something of the detachment that you get particularly with a camera. Actually, if you have a camera and a microphone on a boom and a crew with you, there's both a level of intimacy and there's also it's a balancing act really between a kind of detachment, a distance, and an impartiality, but also an intimacy of getting people to talk, trying to help people forget the camera, forget the boom microphone.
Getting to the heart of the story.
Getting to the heart of the story and trying to find a way of giving people both the space but also some structure to tell their own stories. So I learned a huge amount in that, and I felt passionately vocational about it. And to some extent, that's totally connected to my writing life, that sense of telling stories.
Kate, was there anything that resonated with you in what Polly was saying in terms of the connection between your two related careers? I mean, how does that compare with your own experience of moving from one to the other?
Well, I think mine is much more closely linked, I would say, in that it was extremely, the reason I got published was because I was a publisher. No doubt about it, because I was kind of propelled into writing by sitting with a friend who was an agent, and I was expecting my second child, and I was at the very beginning of setting up the Women's Prize for Fiction, and there was a committee of us and we were talking about it. And I said, it's really extraordinary. When I was pregnant the first time around, the book I really wanted to read wasn't there. And then I'm pregnant again, and the book is still not there. And he challenged me. He said, well, why don't you stop moaning and write it? And of course, you know what I'm like. I said, all right, I will. I didn't really think any more about it. And the way I tell the story is much better because I am a novelist. I say that he rang up the next day and said, I've got a contract for you to write this book. But in fact, he says it was a couple of weeks. But my story is better. That's the point about writing novels. So, I got published because of that. What does chime with what Polly was saying is the experiences you've had and the understanding that there are different ways to tell stories. Now, you and I, Caroline, I write nonfiction and fiction. You write nonfiction. But you tell stories and I tell stories. And that's the point. So different subjects require a different narrative, if you like. So I knew that. It was very helpful in some respects because I was trained as an editor. So I know about beginning, middle and end and, how to build up tension and how to hold things back and all of that kind of thing. But also when I came to be actually published, it was a little bit, not a drawback, but I'm sure it was painfully annoying for my publishers because I would be asking questions saying, and so how many books have we got airside? And they were going, oh, God, she knows what that means. So I knew stuff. So they couldn't pull the wool over my eyes in terms of, was this going well or badly or okay? Because I did know those metrics. But certainly on balance, it was a great start.
Yes, I think for a lot of writers who don't know the publishing industry, it's completely baffling at the beginning, isn't it? So I guess you didn't have quite as steep
I was never baffled.
Learning curve. No. So But we shouldn't give the impression that you jump straight from working in publishing to becoming a best-selling published authors. I know that as for many authors, it took time for your first big success to come with Labyrinth, which was your 5th published novel, as we've said, and by which time I know you'd established the Women's Prize for Fiction and I think worked in the theatre. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Here's playwright Aisha Zia talking about not giving up work until she had several plays under her belt. And I think it also introduces the idea that writing is proper work.
The best advice I received as a writer was to go and get a job. And the funny thing is, I did it without even thinking about it. The reason why this was the best advice is, one, it gives you the opportunity to go and get some life experience. I was a picture editor for 10 years, working from hard news to features. It was the hub of information. It was really inspiring. It made me feel busy and confident, which isn't something that comes easily as a writer. And it made me feel like I was good at working. All of this is invaluable, especially when you sit down to actually write. Secondly, it takes off the financial strain, so you can think and write on the side, which I did evenings and weekends. This worked really well for about 3 years until the writing took over, and then I had to make a really tough decision. I was torn between 2 jobs I really loved. They say don't quit your day job, so I didn't take that piece of advice and quit my day job as a picture editor to write full-time. Sometimes in life you have to give it everything so you know you gave it your best shot, and this was my time to be brave. I had to choose writing because this was more than just a job. It was something I was passionate about, and I felt I owed it to myself and my art to explore that further. I quit my full-time job at the Financial Times 5 years ago after being commissioned to write my second full-length play, No Guts, No Heart, No Glory. That play and my first play, Hourglass House, were based on testimonies from real people and real stories. I attribute the success of these 2 shows to my journalistic work experience and process. It made my work richer, but also helped me to understand people, their lives, and the type of stories they want to tell. My interest in news and current affairs made me fine-tune my knowledge of issues that affect us in the times we live in, anchoring my work in reality, making my work not only diverse and rich, but also relevant. Though I have felt a lot poorer and a bit more disorganised, I have not regretted quitting my job. I still freelance occasionally and more recently have thought about going back to some full-time work just to take a break from writing full-time. It can be lonely and intense, and when you lose self-confidence, having some structure and normality to your life can help. Having other things to occupy your time and brain can be really useful, and I think it's really important to give yourself the time and space to let the writing come to you rather than always chasing it.
The mention there of going back to a, in inverted commas, proper job as a relief from actually writing.
Absolutely. Yes. I think, my pattern is slightly different, I suppose, because I wrote 2 non-fiction and 2 fiction before I became, at the age of 44, an overnight success with Labyrinth, as you said, which came out in 2005. So I had already made the brave decision, oddly, not to do with writing, but to do with leaving publishing. And that had been a big decision. I was offered a big job in publishing, and I had to ask myself, I'd fallen into it. Is this what you want to do, Kate? Is running a big publishing company what you want from your career? Because if it is, then you take it and you go for it. But if not, you must be brave enough to step out now, because otherwise you will never have the chance again. And so we'd gone from, my husband and I, from me having a good salary with all the things that go with a salary and an office and a car and all this kind of malarkey, and 2 children, one on the way and one physically already with us, to having between us a combined income of £5,000. And it was a really big shock, but brilliant, because that actually is a more real experience for writers. The idea that people would decide to be a writer as their career, to most of us who are old, is just laughable. If that suddenly happened, I still, I'm in my 60s now, I still pinch myself that this is actually my day job, because I don't believe anybody thinks that writing will pay the bills. It's something you really want to do. And so it was for me, I suppose. And but I love the idea that you've got to be bold, because that is true. You've got to be bold, even if it isn't about giving up a job, or even if you are in a very lucky position that you can afford to not have a job and you're writing at the same time. You have to be bold to put yourself out there, to share your characters and your ideas and your thoughts. And, the great Anita Bruckner once said that having a novel published is like having a layer of skin removed. And she's right in that you feel, however confident you are, and I am, and however much of a grown-up you are, and I am, you still feel vulnerable at the moment your book goes out into the world in a way that you don't with almost anything else. So, that idea of courage to be a writer, I think, is a really good point.
But it is so complex being a writer, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you have to be an ultra realist about it. But on the other hand, we have to also pinch ourselves that we get to do this creative stuff to earn a living, small though that living may be. And it's I find it quite a strange dichotomy, that whole thing.
Yes, it is. But I think, those of us who are parents and we give advice to our children who may or may not be listening to the advice. But the advice I always gave to my daughter and my son was, all you need to find in life in terms of the work you're doing is something that when you're doing it, you do not notice that time is passing. Now, for me, that's writing. For other people, for my daughter, it's absolutely not. She works in art. My son, for 10 years, was in music theatre and last year signed his first 3-book deal and is writing a series of novels, the first of which will come out in 2026. And he's had that same experience of going from getting a very lovely salary in music theatre to deep breath, sort of, can I afford to go out for a coffee, or maybe I better make it at home? But that's the point. It's about deciding where your priorities are and understanding that a job or a career, or however you describe it, it is the way that for a lot of your life, you will spend most of your time. So knowing what will fulfill you and make you feel most like yourself and most that you are in the world in the way you want to be, find that. And then, if necessary, make the money work around it. And that might be, most authors, as you know, have other jobs. I know almost nobody who doesn't have some other form of income as well, whether it's teaching or, whatever else it is.
That is sterling advice. It really is. Now, we just heard from Aisha Zia, and she's a playwright. The theatre's been a big influence on your work, and it's been a big part of your life. So do you want to say something about that? And also, are your novels, in some sense, a bit of a stage set? Are you a theatrical writer in any way?
Well, that's a lovely question. And yes, absolutely. I often, when I'm talking about how I write, my process of writing a novel in particular, but actually nonfiction as well, I do always talk in terms of theatre. I talk in terms of my research being like building a stage set, and that I know the sort of character that I need, and then I build the stage set. I know exactly the atmosphere, the texture, the kind of granular sense of what I want the novel to be. But then I stand alone on the empty stage and wait for actors to come in from the wings. And it always is like that for me. So I know, with the Map of Bones, I knew that the lead character in the 17th century was going to be Suzanne. I knew that she would have suffered a very extreme trauma, and that she had understood that the only way to heal herself, to get past that, was to actually go in search of another woman in her family who had been brave and courageous, and that act of finding the pirate Commander Louise, from whom she was descended, would be a way of navigating herself through what had happened. But beyond that, I didn't know what the story was going to be. I didn't know who else was going to be in it. I didn't know really when it was going to start or where I was going to end up. But that's because I am older and I've been writing a long time, and before that, editing other people's books. So have the confidence to believe that if I start writing with all of this stage set around me, that the character will arrive and she and I will discover the story together. And that is always what's happened to me so far. When I did start writing plays, however, it got in the way of my novel writing, interestingly. And that is because your job as a playwright, and it was very interesting listening to Aisha talking then, very clear I thought she was. Your job as a playwright is to come up with beautiful words to put in people's mouths. Your job is not to create the stage set. Your job is not to tell the actor how to say the line. So when I did an adaptation of one of my earlier books, The Taxidermist's Daughter, for Chichester Festival Theatre, and it was the show that opened the 2022 season. It was actually the first new play written by a woman ever on the main stage in its 60-year history. We all clear our throats. Firstly, I found it quite difficult to adapt my own work because I was trying to manage too much. But secondly, more surprisingly, when I went back to write my next novel, I forgot to do the descriptions. Now, we know that one of the reasons that people like my books is for place, the sense of place, the descriptions of history, of land, of light, all of these things. And I read, first couple of chapters, and I thought, this is very flat. I thought, well, that's because you've just put some dialogue. So I had to unlearn some of the things I had to do as a playwright in order to return to my novelistic voice. But it did me good because it made me much more forensic in saying, what is the purpose of this word? What is the purpose of that sentence? A long play is 20,000 words. A quite long screenplay is possibly 12,000. My novels are about 130,000. So in other words, I've been very profligate with my words. That's been a very good discipline because as you get older as a writer, and particularly if you're lucky enough to have had success, it's very important you keep trying to improve your skill and your craft. And you don't just rest on your laurels, I suppose. You know, that you each time do that thing. What is this chapter doing? What is this character doing? If they haven't earned their place, out they go.
That's fascinating. Well, let's go on to that sense of place that you were talking about that people really love in your novels. We've been talking about The Map of Bones, which opens in La Rochelle in France in the late 17th century and then transports us to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. And your celebrated Languedoc trilogy, of course, takes us to southwest France. As you said there, you work really hard and creatively to help us see and sense the places that you describe in your novels, what the houses are like inside and outside, the layout of the towns, the streets, and the sights and the smells. So I'd love to talk to you a bit about the importance of landscape and sense of place when you start a book and hear a bit about the research you do to weave this magic. So to get us in the mood for the next part of the conversation, let's listen to Simon Robson describing a route and a setting that has captured his writing imagination.
Simon Robson, The Ridgeway. Wikipedia will tell you that the Ridgeway is Britain's oldest road, that it runs east from the Berkshire Downs, drops to the Thames at Goring, then rises again and meanders on into East Anglia towards the Wash, that it has been a thoroughfare for 5,000 years, and that it offered respite to shepherds and soldiers and all travellers who sought the safety of higher ground away from the mud and corruptions of society. It name drops the abstract beauty of Uffington White Horse, the stone circles of Avebury below, and the numerous hill forts and fortifications that pockmark the smooth face of the downland that stretches across southern England. As a child, growing up outside Swindon, it was always there, a long line of green like a wave waiting to break on the villages and homesteads, farms and cottages of the plain. It offered, as no doubt those who live in sight of the sea feel, a constant, immutable horizon, a pure, ascetic backdrop to more worldly pursuits. Except that eventually, horizons have a habit of pulling us towards them. The sea eventually makes a sailor. That which is on the horizon seems to say, don't forget, I am still here. I am that which will outlive you. I am that against which you will judge your life's success. And when such a horizon covers the bones of so many dead, those that carved the horse and built the forts and drove the sheep, well, it's much like the scientists who pore over those photographs of the cosmos that show an ancient light so distant it left its parent star as Christ was crucified or mastodons grazed or even before we had sun or earth at all. Swindon itself was once a modest Wiltshire market town on a hill facing the ridge. Then, in the early 19th century, Isambard Kingdom Brunel arrived and the town came down off the hill and set up shop on the plain below, speaking the language of commerce, giving poor men and women holidays, and joining east to west along the lone and level rails of the Great Western Railway. For From the now quiet and empty streets of the old town, from the shabby gents' outfitters and redundant market square, the benign tsunami of the Ridgeway still hangs unbroken. No capitalist imperative calling it down. Now it is a National Trust trail. It is a green road that links nowhere to nowhere.
What a great phrase, that constant, immutable horizon.
That was absolutely beautiful. And also his voice, so wonderful. And that took me exactly to the landscapes that I look over, in the Sussex Downs, not quite as far over as him. And the fact that I still walk there to think of my parents, who are both gone and I miss very much, because I remember myself as a child looking down over that same landscape. And of course it does change, as he says, but the spire of Chichester Cathedral is always there, the Fishbourne Marshes you can see from the top of the Trundle, and that sense of England that doesn't change, that immutable sense of place, chimes very strongly with me, very strong.
Well, you just conjured the Downs, as Simon did. But what about places that you don't know so well and that you decide are going to be settings? I mean, Simon mentioned Wikipedia at the beginning. I know your research, as his surely does, goes way beyond that. But
one would hope so.
One would hope so, yeah. Tell me a bit about the process of establishing setting. I mean, for example, do you absolutely have to visit the place that you've decided to write about?
I have never in my career, and I can't imagine ever doing it, decided to set a book somewhere. It always comes from the place. It's the being there and thinking, oh, there's a story that I could tell here. So, yes, it's completely the other way round, if you like. So the reason I started to write about Carcassonne and the stories of the southwest of France is because, for a reason of, coincidences and happenstances, really, I found myself in 1989 in Carcassonne, and I walked through the modern town, which is 14th century, and I stepped up onto the Pont Vieux, the old bridge, and saw Carcassonne, the medieval citadel, ahead on the hill in the November evening mist. And it was, what we would say in France is a coup de foudre. It was, I just fell head over heels in love. But more than that, I thought, I belong here. I can write a story here. And it was the first experience I had of what happens every time for me in fiction, which is what I call the whispering in the landscape. And so it's that idea, that kind of that there are almost like voices telling me, here, this story could be told. And there are many places in the world that I love, but the voices are silent. Now, I love New York, but there's never been a single voice that's spoken to me there. So it's certain places.
Oh, so beautifully articulated. And I was thinking about history. I mean, the clip from Simon Robson, we sort of roved through different time periods along the Ridgeway. Physicists talk about it, don't they? The sense of time not being a linear thing, that different time frames are sort of present side by side. I can feel goosebumps as I'm talking about it. But I guess there are just places and times, aren't there, where history feels very close and starts whispering to you.
Absolutely. And I mean, I don't find this in any way a morbid thought. What I find when I'm walking in the Pyrenees, when I'm walking on the Fishbourne Marshes, the Sussex Downs, is a real sense of all the people that have walked these paths before me and all the people that will walk these paths long after I'm in the ground. And I find that a comforting and wonderful thing, the idea that the land holds the truth of human experience, that it is our library in a funny sort of way. And I was absolutely rubbish at geography at school. I wish I'd tried harder, actually, so that I understood more about those kind of things, the kind of palimpsest that you get in a hill or something. But you had to choose history or geography in my school, and there was never going to be any competition there.
And I think this must be then where the characters come in, because, of course, it's important not to overdo the historical detail as a novelist, isn't it? When we don't want a regurgitated textbook. I think you strike that balance beautifully in your fiction. But at the same time, I really love learning about a historical period, which I didn't know much about. I mean, when it comes to the Joubert Chronicles, I knew a little bit about the Huguenots, but I really love learning more about them and where their refugee journeys took them, whilst also really enjoying the story, of course.
Yes, well, I don't describe my fiction as historical fiction. I feel I write historical adventure. I think that's very different because momentum and plot and the sense of a story hurtling towards a climax. That is what drives me. So the history is there because I'm passionate about history and I like putting history on the page. But there is no historical detail that's there that doesn't matter. So what I would never do is have a long description of a castle for the sake of proving that I had done my research into that particular castle. So if I tell the reader that a man has got a beard or a woman has a particular buckle on her shoe, it is because later the beard will be the thing that gives him away, or the buckle will come off and be the thing that's found. So it is historical research. And I am saying to the reader, at this period of time, men looked like this and women wore things like that. But every piece of historical detail has a purpose within the plot. It's not there for background.
Are you a professional writer, a novelist, poet, translator, or playwright? Imagine using your skills to support students in higher education while also supplementing your income. The Royal Literary Fund Fellowship is now accepting applications, and we're searching for dedicated professional writers like you to join us at over 80 universities and colleges across the UK. Share your writing and editing skills with students at every level across a variety of subjects, from art to engineering, from nursing to law. Become an RLF Fellow and you'll have the opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of others while earning £16,000 a year for part-time work. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and apply today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
You were talking there about writing about people and times that you care about. And that brings me beautifully onto our fourth theme, which is about writing and issues and people that matter to you. I guess we could call it activist writing in a sense. So we could mention your non-fiction here. You wrote a book called An Extra Pair of Hands about caring for your elderly parents and your mother-in-law to elevate the responsibilities and joys of caring for our loved ones. And Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, How Women Also Built the World, is exactly what it suggests, a sort of celebration of women through history, who we should know much more about, but don't. But also, of course, with the Women's Prizes for Fiction and Non-Fiction, which you set up in your own words to honour, amplify and promote exceptional writing by women and to press those books into the hands of readers, female and male, who will appreciate them. So to introduce this, let's hear Charlie Hill. And he's talking about his sense of needing to write more directly about certain issues these days and his feeling that nuance might be unhelpful in certain cases.
You said about complicating the battle.
Yeah, no, well, actually, oddly enough, it has always been that. It has always been to write, I suppose, to write against something initially, but that is part of the same thing. You take a side on which, you might 99.9% of the time identify with, and then you say, why might I not? And you try and pick holes in your own sort of belief systems. So you start off by doing that, and I thought that was the job of the writer, and I still do to an extent. But I also think that we may be entering a time in which there needs to be, or there possibly should be, a shift in attitudes. If you're a writer who is politically engaged or who fancies himself to be politically engaged, I think there are certain subjects now about which we shouldn't really be seeking to complicate the battle or to pick holes in. I think there are certain subjects that if we were to write about them now, we kind of need to be slightly less nuanced, and maybe which goes counter to everything, as I said, everything I've sort of thought up until this point. I'm thinking specifically, or particularly, I should say, just about climate change. And I wrote a piece for Writers Rebel, which is the Extinction Rebellion site for writers, basically. And this was it's only about 18 months ago, if that. And it was full of this sort of nuance and and I was trying to pack an awful lot in, and it was published, and it was an all right piece, and I'm quite happy with it and all that sort of thing. But I would do that differently now. So this is a recent shift. It's been over the course of the last 18 months. I was talking to a visual artist about a collaboration. It was about sort of 2016. And she was German heritage, and we were talking about Trump, and we were talking about Brexit, and we were talking about other sort of shifts, political shifts, societal shifts, cultural shifts. And then this sort of subject came up, and it was like, do we now need to sort of be a little bit more upfront, a little bit more forthright? Do writers need to, when they address certain subjects, be slightly less nuanced and slightly less, try slightly less to see both sides, or to play devil's advocate, and just come out and be a bit more, do you know what, right? I think enough is enough. And it's very difficult. I mean, I haven't actually succeeded in writing anything like that yet, because it kind of bores me, and it doesn't particularly make for interesting writing. It's just something I'd say that Writer's Rebel piece, when I'd done it, I thought, do you know what? Why am I interrogating the position? Do you know what I mean? I've been, I'm writing for the website, so I obviously have sympathy for the actions of Extinction Rebellion, and I think there are very good reasons to have those sympathies. Why am I then my instincts are still to sort of interrogate that position, and to sort of look at climate change through a sort of almost a contrary sort of thing. It's like, no, come on.
Well, there's a bit of a dilemma going on there. So Charlie talked about the job of the writer, and I do feel a real sense of purpose through all your writing and your career. I wonder if you consider yourself a politically engaged writer, though. You have a pretty prominent platform these days. You're Kate Mosse CBE, Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Do you feel more responsibility to be an activist, to engage with injustice, and in Charlie's words, to be less nuanced? Or does the writing, the reader, always come first, in a sense?
Yes, that was very interesting, Charlie's interview. I don't agree with him, funnily enough. I think that one of the reasons the world is in such a parlous state and such an ugly place for most people is precisely that extremism in opinion as well as behaviour has become seen as the right thing to do. The idea that it's all or nothing. You're either for me or you're against me. And if the purpose of writing and activism is to carry people with you and to change people's points of view so that more people think like you, then nuance is essential. Because otherwise you're only ever speaking to the people who agree with you. And so in my area, I haven't become more political. I've always been political. But I have always been someone who believes in travelling hopefully, in that you should not be tribal, whether it's party political or anything else. And what I mean by that is the very childlike, well, she doesn't agree with me on this, and therefore everything she says is beyond the pale. Well, what about she's done some really great things here? I don't agree with her on that, and I do agree with her on that. And I think every attempt to make it all or nothing is what leads us to where we are now, because the majority of people are sophisticated in their thinking. They sit somewhere in between. For me, I'm very rarely seen as a political writer, but I would say that everything I've ever written has been political, because it's been about saying women have always been here. We have always done everything that men have done, actually. People will quibble and say, well, men went out hunting. And yeah, they did, except if there were no men, the women went out hunting. So the point is that the way history is written has given an impression of utter codified behaviour, which was never true. And when people say to me, you always write strong women, I say, well, have you not met any women? As if that's a surprising thing. I mean, it's just the most bizarre thing to say. So the point is that women and men can be completely aligned, completely at odds. I do agree with Charlie absolutely in terms of there are things where you must make a stand. Absolutely. Racism is wrong. Genocide is wrong. Sexism is wrong. We could go on. But once you've made those kind of single-sentence statements, it's more about how you change things, what you do. An Extra Pair of Hands is my book about my experiences as a full-time carer over 15 years. That's not sold as a political book, but care is the most significant feminist issue of our time, which is never seen as a feminist issue. But 50% of women by the time they're 59 will be a full-time carer. That odds for men is only when they're about 75, which suggests to all of the caring agencies that probably men care for their partner and women care for everybody. because it's women's work and it's therefore expected to be done for free, it gets no attention, the lowest of all the statutory benefits that people can get. And it's an enormous issue. If women laid down tools, society would collapse. But is that sold as a political book? No, because I don't write it like that. So if you like, my campaigning has always been, we're all in this together. How do you make the world better for more people? How do we get along better with everybody? How do we make things fairer? You know, if you like, the F word is fairness as much as anything else. With my fiction, the same. Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, and the young adult book I've got coming out this year, Feminist History for Every Day of the Year, that's very much about saying to girls, boys, and everybody, do you know about this woman? Do you know that even 50 years ago, if you're a girl and then a woman, you couldn't have a credit card in your own name? Do you know that you couldn't get contraception unless your husband, and when you start saying things like that and they go, what? That's in my granny's lifetime. You go, every single right we have has been fought for by someone, and that's why we have to protect it. So my politics is about activism in the world. It isn't single issue activism. I admire enormously the people who have single issue activism because that changes things, but that is not what I do, except that everything I do is about saying women's voices matter.
I think you just redefined what we mean by political writing. That was just marvellous. Okay, so for our final theme, let's talk about writing routine. And it's something that writers are often quizzed about, from the time of day that they write best to the stationery that they prefer. I think with you, it's more about how on earth do you prioritise and corral your writing time when you wear so many hats, whether it's teaching creative writing or being on a board or looking after 2 major literary prizes or indeed caring for your mother-in-law, Granny Rosie, and making time for your family, including you've got a grandchild now.
Yes.
So
I am a granny. It's the
you're
best
a granny
thing.
too. So to spark us off on this thorny perennial topic, let's hear from Mirza Waheed, reflecting on the challenges of writing while parenting. And can I just say, I like that we're hearing from a bloke on this issue, because so often it's only women writers who are asked how they juggle, she said with a shudder.
My day is often bookended by 2 school runs. It took me around a year to internalize that as a stay-at-home dad, I do not have the day to myself. When I left my day job at the BBC a decade ago, the sudden sense of liberation I felt may have deceived me into thinking I have long days of reading and writing in front of me, all the time in the world. I drop my son at his nursery, then go to a nearby library and fiddle with the laptop until something happened, a passage took off, or a section gave the appearance of narrative momentum. We all know the routine, good days and bad days. I managed all right, producing a second novel while being an all-right parent to our firstborn. I must note that my wife, at full-time work 5 days a week, did everything to support my habit. It was fine. I was writing full-time, loving it, sometimes even going to Tuscany on a writing residency. All that changed, or perhaps crashed might be a better word, when the second child arrived a few years later. Now, we had a school-going child and an infant in the pram. They had different lives, different points of view, and separate, often manic demands. Just when you started to look at that page, someone needed a diaper change. As soon as you got into a rhythm later in the day, or told yourself you're in the zone, another one cried, "I want snacks, Dad." Words such as concentration and focus acquired new meanings. There was no such thing as uninterrupted time. Even when the children weren't at home, the mind was sometimes suddenly hijacked by thoughts of milk, bananas, Weetabix, or simply, "Oh God, is that the change of clothes staring at me from the kitchen table?" But the human mind is an adaptable, somehow upgradable processor. It gets rewired. Or at least that's what you tell yourself to work with what's available. Yes, it's not perfect, far from ideal conditions, etc., etc. The quiet den where no one dares enter is a complete myth. But you learn, retrain yourself, even if it all feels desperate, full of existential dread, or dispiriting tedium. Now, you don't come back home straight from the nursery or the school run. You take a round of the park to let fresh air wash over you. You walk, and at some point, you find yourself thinking about that secondary character in your work in progress. What might she think of her absentee father during her morning walks? Let me go back to the two bookends of the writing day. Now you know you have until 3 p.m. to do what you do. And you know it's not even half a day when you factor in your rituals, the necessary procrastination things, the internet ablutions, someone said something outrageous on the social and so on. At last, you shut yourself and type away furiously or lazily. You know you're up against a deadline. Also, you don't want to forget to pick them up. Of course, on occasion, you ring up another parent, panting, "Could you please? I'm on the way, just a tiny bit late." At night, you're exhausted from all the attempts at trying to work. You crash, but a part of the brain is at work on the story. You're revising some or all of what you somehow managed to write during the day.
No such thing as uninterrupted time, Mirza says. I mean, that resonated so much with me and brought back so many memories of that sort of 3 p.m. deadline. Your own children are grown up now, Kate, but I mean, presumably that does resonate in terms of trying to write and fit in everything else as well.
Yes, I thought that was really charming and lovely, that description. But I also think he put his finger on something really important, and I would certainly say it was important for me, is that if you have caring responsibilities, whatever they are, that mean that your time is not quite your own because there is a different schedule that has to come first. And that can be looking after an older person. You know, if there's a fall, there's a fall. Things need to be done when they need to be done. And that's the same with a baby or a child. You know, when one child has pulled the other one out of the high chair, you can't say, "I'm just finishing this chapter." You do need to go and deal with it. But it's certainly, I would say, becoming a mother absolutely made me more efficient. Because that sense before of you have all the time in the world to mull about and drift, you know, rather like the French lieutenant's woman, looking, you know, rather glamorous as you write the novel. You know, the minute you have, okay, you've got 2 hours now, use them. And that takes away quite a lot of the faffery of writing, which is, I'm not feeling in the mood. Just get on with it. So that certainly did. But I essentially divide my year into two halves. So when I'm being a writer, my own work is my priority, and I can do that. When I'm doing the Women's Prize for Fiction and now the Women's Prize for Nonfiction, other people's work is my priority. So I tend to write from the end of June till Christmas. I then will be editing January, February, because although there will be Women's Prize, we'll be meeting the judges and there'll be judging meetings and things, the Women's Prize, once we announce the long lists in March usually, then my head is taken up with promoting and supporting other women. And it's not my time then to be a writer. So I always really make sure that I'm never promoting a book of my own, and I'm never writing in that time period. And then you fit everything else in. You know, I'm on the board of the British Library, which is marvellous, but takes up time. I'm involved in various local arts organisation, which is also marvellous, but takes up time. And you just fit those things in. I mean, the thing that is the big difference is when you add something huge into the mix. The Labyrinth tour this spring is an enormous thing to be adding into the mix, because that's 6 weeks of a different town every night. And that is celebrating the 20th anniversary of Labyrinth. It's 20 years since Labyrinth was published. And it's a show, a one-woman show, you know, an hour before the interval, an hour after, me on stage on my own, talking about the real history behind Labyrinth, the real mysticism, the Nazi Grail hunters, the tradition of labyrinths in France. You know, why are there more labyrinths in France than the whole of the rest of Europe put together? All of that kind of esoteric stuff that fueled the book. And that obviously is like dropping a hand grenade into the middle of the very well-arranged writing and Women's Prize schedule. But you've got to do it. You know, you've got to keep doing new things and challenging yourself and having a lovely time. And you will probably not be surprised to know I do quite like performing on stage.
It's such a change of register, though. That's all sorts of different. I get the sense that you thrive on that, definitely. I
like a crowd, and also, I mean, I really enjoy I love going on a book tour, but that's, you go to a bookshop, you give a talk, you sign books, and that's fantastic because I love meeting readers. Performing, being on stage in a theatre with possibly 1,000 people is a very different experience because it's a different sort of intimacy. And it is about creating a moment, a unique moment, that even if you're on stage the next day somewhere else, it's not the same. So it is very different from doing a book talk. My first tour was for Warrior Queen's Quiet Revolutionaries. And on the first preview, when the music started backstage, it's the only time in my whole career I've thought, I can't do this. I can't go on. I was genuinely, actually shaking. I thought, I just can't do it. And then, of course, the music finished and you have that choice. And of course, you do go on. Probably wasn't the best show that I ever did, but you get on with it. But it's a very different kind of emotion from talking about your beloved book to wonderful readers who've possibly even read the book, and it's much more intimate, even in a big festival. Even if you've got 1,000 people in your audience, a book audience is different from a theatre audience. Not least of all, theatre audiences almost always have Maltesers. And sometimes wine.
That sounds so exciting. Well, to the little things that help. Little things are important when you're trying to, your year is, as I say, great changes of register and so much going on. I read an interview that your guilty pleasure is mini cheddars. And this is a guilty pleasure that I share with you, and even more guiltily now that there's so much emphasis on not eating ultra-processed foods. But I think we writers are allowed snacks. But I also think you're a great advocate for writers being kind to themselves, and creativity is hard work. So tell us about the little things that help you along through everything that you do.
Well, as I have got older, I have very sadly had to acknowledge that I just can't handle caffeine anymore. So it took me a long time to find decaffeinated coffee that was remotely drinkable, because that first cup of coffee, I write very early in the day before anybody else has woken up, and I just can't do it without that taste. I mean, of course I could do it without that taste, but it's part of the process, coming down, getting that cup of coffee, sitting usually in the dark in front of your computer, just the monitor flashing, and that first sip of coffee in the morning. So that was a very, very significant moment when I finally found some coffee that was, drinkable, that was decaffeinated. I'm very good at, much like several of the people that we've heard today, walking is very, very important for writers. I mean, exercise is important, but walking in particular. One, because it loosens your back and your shoulders. And secondly, for me, because it leaves you free to think. I never listen to music or podcasts when I'm walking. I always am absolutely just with myself in my own head. So I make sure that however tight a deadline I'm on, however many things I've got on my plate, however hassled I feel about how am I going to manage it all, I every day make sure I leave my desk and go out. And then I am a great believer in a treat at the end of the day, particularly if you work at home as opposed to in a library, or you have a separate, office space you go to, or a shared working space you go to. I think that is the challenge often, is that how do you distinguish your home day from your work day if it's all in the same place? So for me, it would, probably be a glass of wine, or I'm afraid I have a very humble palate. I mean, basically a baked potato. And I'm quite capable of eating a baked potato every single day, actually, without any variance. But I think it's that being kind to yourself and having things that help punctuate your day is very, very important. And it goes back to people who do have children or can remember their own experiences. You can't revise every second of the day. That won't make you do better in your GCSEs, or in my case, O-levels. So find ways of, in a good way, breaking your day up so that you don't, at the end of the day, feel just worn out by the business of working. It's good to feel tired and satisfied at the end of your working day, but not absolutely worn out. So look after yourself is a very big piece of advice for writers.
Very sound advice indeed. It's been such a pleasure, Kate. Thank you so much for joining us on the Collected podcast.
It's been lovely to be here, Caroline. Thank you.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFcollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.